I want to welcome everyone to Drisha's Fall Programming and the fourth part out of six-part session course on the laws of Kashrut and Jewish-Gentile relations by Dr. Shana Strauch Schick.
Thank you so much. And welcome back, everyone. It's good to be here in our fourth class on the laws of Kashrut and Jewish-Gentile relations. So we're going to continue our discussion from last time, where we began talking about pat akum, the bread baked by a non-Jew. Now, we didn't get so far, so we are going to be looking at the same text we saw last time, the source book, the collections that I sent, and I did add a few more that hopefully we will be able to cover this time. And I've also put in English translations for all the Talmudic texts that we're going to look at. So hopefully I'll make it easier for some people to follow along. So we've already done the first part of the sources, which is the prohibition. So just to review what we've already seen, make this bigger. Okay, we're dealing with the prohibition of pat akum, bread baked by a non-Jew, and of course this is found in our Mishnah in Avodah Zarah 2:6, which lists all these various products which were made prohibited by the rabbis, not because they're unkosher per se, but rather to often to prevent too much mixing between Jews and non-Jews. Now, this is particularly the case with bread when there isn't really anything non-kosher that could be put in it. Usually it's just flour and water, basically. And so we saw that the really main reason for this prohibition is intermarriage. And we saw, lest you come to have their oil and then their wine. And if you drink together, you mix together. And if you mix together, then you may marry each other. And if you marry each other, then that leads to basically leaving Judaism and halakhah, and in this case of Tractate Avodah Zarah, worshiping idolatry. So that's the reason for the prohibition, meaning as opposed to a bishul akum, the food cooked by a non-Jew, we saw that there were two reasons given. One was if you eat together, you may come to mix, and then that could lead to ultimate intermarriage. But also here that if a non-Jew cooks your food, they might add non-kosher ingredients to it. So that had more of a concern for treif, for kashrut. Whereas bread, it seems to be a purely social issue. Okay, so now we're going to analyze what is the relationship between bishul akum and pat akum, because as I mentioned last time, if you can't have the food cooked by a non-Jew, well, then obviously you can't have the bread baked by a non-Jew as well. Baking bread falls under the category of cooking food. So the question is, are they really one in the same prohibition? Or are they two different ones with two different set of halakhot which applies to them? So we had already seen the first, in number 2 on page 1 of the sources, the Gemara in the Bavli Avodah Zarah Lamachet Amabet. We had read through that last time, so I brought a few again, and this time I brought the English as well. And you see in A, B, C, and D, as I labeled it now, it talks about different ways that a Jew could be involved, either in cooking food or baking bread. So in A, B, and C, it's talking about when one cooks. And in each of these lines of the Gemara, a Jew has to be involved. So I'll just read it through again to review. So this is in Gemara Avodah Zarah, Daf Lamechet Amud Bet. The first line says, and I labeled it A, eat a bailu, and you have the English below, and you can follow along A to A, so it makes it easier to see where the English translation is. So A, Ibailuhu. Dilemma was raised before the rabbi. So they raised the following question. What if a non-Jew puts the food on the fire and the Jew turns it over? So this is a text we had saw in our discussion of bishul akum, when a non-Jew cooks food. So what if a Jew turns the food over? So in B, Amar Rabbi Nachman bar Yitzchak, so Nachman bar Yitzchak says, Kal v'chomer. Obviously, it's okay. If mutar, if it would be okay with a non-Jew completes the cooking, how much more so should it be allowed if it's a Jew who completes the cooking? It's marnami. Then in C, it brings a related halakhah, or related statement. Amar Rabbi Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Amar Acha, Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So it's two different traditions about who quoted. Rabbi Yochanan says as follows: Ben shenech oved kochavim hafach Yisrael, ben shenech Yisrael hafach oved kochavim mutar. Whether it's a Jew who put the food on the fire and a non-Jew who turns it over, or a non-Jew put the food on the fire and a Jew who turns it over, the food is allowed. This is not a bishul akum. It's only prohibited if the whole cooking had been done by a non-Jew. So this is all about bishul, cooking. Then in a D, it seems to take a shift. Amar Ra'avina. Ra'avina said, Hilchata, the law is, Ha rifta de shagar oved kochavim b'fa Yisrael. If you have bread baked in an oven, that, well, Rashi says rifta means oven. So anyways, you have an oven that a non-Jew, a yuled and a Jew are baked in. Inam shagar Yisrael b'fa oved kochavim. Or a Jew yielded and a non-Jew baked in it. Or a non-Jew yielded, baked in it, and all a Jew did was stoke the coals, shafir dami. That is okay. So only in this last case does it raise the possibility that stoking the coals is an adequate amount of intervention for a Jew to make the food not kosher. So the question is, since that was about baking, is that leniency about stoking the coals limited to baking bread, to pat akum? Or does it also apply to a bishul akum? Now, since we learned a bishul akum, we know that the Ashkenazim wanted to apply that to a bishul akum as well. But I'm going back to the basics here and want to know, is there a difference between a bishul akum and a pat akum? Or in other words, why do I have to have a separate class on a pat akum? Why couldn't we just have a bishul akum? And from there we know about pat akum as well. So in the next source you have the Ran, Rabbeinu Nisim from Gerona, a medieval commentator on the Bavli. He brings the following reasons for why the Mishnah lists pat and halakhot as two different categories. And why couldn't we just have a halakhot, food cooked by non-Jews? And from there we know that pat akum, bread baked by non-Jews, is also obviously prohibited as well. So the Ran gives two answers. So he says, Mifarash beGemara, so it's explained in the Gemara, She'isira shapat mishum chatnut, that the prohibition against eating bread baked by a non-Jew is due to a fear that will lead to intermarriage. Mishum gamkin, and also oil, the afish halakhot, and even cooked food as well. Perish Rashi shemishum chatnut asu. Remember, Rashi explained that also the reason for a bishul akum, for food cooked by a non-Jew, was also one of a fear of intermarriage as well. The imtomar, Aleph Ataf means imtomar, if you'll say, imkain amai palginu tana dematnisin. If patakum and abishalarkum are for the same reason, and they both are really the same thing, why then does the Mishnah separate them? The atarte, why are they listed as two separate prohibitions? Hare shnehem mishum bishulam ne'esru umishum hatnut. Both bread and cooked food are prohibited because a non-Jew cooks it, and because there's a fear that it'll lead to intermarriage. So aren't these just the same prohibition, asked the Ran. So he gives two reasons. The first reason the Ran gives is, so one is Yesh Lomar, Yud Lam, it is Yesh Lomar, so some say, Shtei Gezerot Havu Talmidei Shammai Vehillel Agazru Apitam Ushmanam Mishum Yenan. So Yesh Lomar Shtei Gezerot. These are actually two different decrees that the students of Shammai and Hillel made. That first they made a decree against bread and wine, and bread and oil because of wine. So the first decree was made by the students of Hillel and Shammai, very early rabbis. And first, the decree was only against eating pat akum, a bread made by a non-Jew, lest you come to have their wine, what we saw. Tarbayu shayche bahade yayin v'shemen mipnei shehu mashke kamahu upat mishum d'shechicha milta. Because both oil and bread are very much tied to wine. Oil, because it's a liquid like wine, and oil, because it's very common. It's what everyone ate. Basically, that was what one's diet consisted of. So oil is like wine in that it's also a liquid, and because bread was just such a prevalent and a constant presence at every meal, therefore, and people eat it, people are always eating bread, and therefore, that was the first prohibition that was made. Abal al hashlakot lo gazru. But originally, the first decree was not against cooked food. First, we have a prohibition against wine. That's its own thing. Then the early rabbis also made a decree against oil because it's so much like wine, and bread because it's such a constant presence at every meal. But originally, there was no decree against eating food cooked by a non-Jew. But then, asa beit din acharina, and then later a beit din came, vegazru b'kol hashlachot mishum hatnut, and later on another court said, you know what, let's just prohibit all cooked food made by non-Jews, lest it lead to intermarriage. Umishum hachi palaginhu. So that's why in the Mishnah these are split up into two separate decrees. Tanadim asintim atarte. So really, yes, these are ultimately the same prohibition, but because they weren't made at the same time, they were historically different. That's why they're not listed together in the Mishnah. But according to this, their laws might be the same. It's just because they weren't made at the same time. So the Mishnah wants to preserve the historical record of these zerot, that originally they were not the same. First, only bread was prohibited along with oil because of wine, and then only later all cooked food was made prohibited as well. So this is a historical reason, says the Ran. So I'll put this here. But then the Ran gives another reason. So that's the reason he gave with Yesh Omrim, that other people say. The linear, but in my opinion, says the Ran, Shapat shel dei kochavim, afilu shenetfashel al yedei Yisrael, kevan she'oved kochavim lasho ve'archo, umin ha'oved kochavim hu lo kacho, aser mishum chatnut. The Ran says there's actually a deeper reason, and it's not just a historical reason. There's rather a more fundamental difference between a bishul akum and pat akum. And now I'll translate what I just read, that when it comes to bread, if the bread belongs to a non-Jew, even if a Jew bakes it, since it was the non-Jew who needed it and worked it, and since this bread actually belongs to the non-Jew, it is always going to be prohibited, no matter what level of involvement the Jew has in the baking process. So says the Ran, pat akum is much more stringent. And as long if a non-Jew owns the bread, it is always going to be not a kosher. Even if the Jew flips the bread, turns it on, turns on the oven, no matter what a Jew does, the bread will always be prohibited, says the Ran. So then what do we do with the text we just saw? Remember in D in the Bavli, we just saw, it said that Rabina said, if you have bread that either the Jew fueled the oven or baked it, or even stoked the coals, that makes it okay. Well, how could that make it okay if, according to the Ran, as long as a non-Jew owns the bread, it's always going to be not a kosher? So the Ran is going to have to say, so I'll just read inside. When the Gemara says that as long as a Jew does one of these three jobs with bread, it's okay. That must be where it's the Jew who owns the bread. And therefore, it's not an issue of pat akum. It's then an issue of bishul akum. And when it comes to bishul akum, as long as a Jew is involved in the cooking in any way, that makes it a kosher. So sharei. So I'll just finish reading. So this is where it's Jew-owned bread. Sharei ein bo isur ela mishum bishulei oved kochavim. As long as a Jew owns the bread, then at most it'll be a problem of being cooked by a non-Jew. The isur b'shulo shel pat hitiru oto chachamim b'achat mishlosh melachot shenaseis al yedei Yisrael. So if it's a bishul akum of a bread, meaning Jewish-owned bread being cooked by a non-Jew, as long as the Jew is involved in one of those steps, lighting the fire, putting the bread in the oven, or stoking the coals, that takes care of the bishul akum problem. Aval bepat shalahem, but if it's non-Jew-owned bread, afilu ne'afat al yedei Yisrael asura. Even if a Jew were to bake it, if a Jew puts it in the oven, it is still prohibited. And that's why the Mishnah lists pat akum and bishul akum as two different halakhot, says the Ran. So he gives two different answers. First, he says, why are they listed as two different prohibitions in the Mishnah? Either it's a historical reason. They are the result of the same prohibition, i.e. bishul akum, but because they were made at two different times, that's why the Mishnah lists them as two different categories, just to preserve the historicity of the gezerah. That's the first answer that the Ran gives. But the one he prefers is, why are they two different gezerot? Because they are two fundamentally different isurim, with each having their own set of halakhot. Okay. Pat akum being much more strict than a bishul akum. Whereas in the case of pat akum, if a non-Jew owns the bread, that bread is now prohibited to be eaten. No matter what a Jew does, that you can put it in the oven, that you can light the fire, that won't help. Pat akum basically has no help for it, says the Ran. A bishul akum, on the other hand, then we have all the kulot, which we learned about in the previous week. You can put it in the oven, and you can adjust the flame. All that will work fine. A bishul akum. So they are different because they are different. They're not the same isurim at all. That's the view of the Ran. Now, the Rambam agrees that Bishul Akum and Pat Akum are two different halakhot and two different gezerot, but he sees it as being the opposite. They're a different gezerot because Pat Akum is much more lenient than a Bishul Akum. So now let's look at these two Rambam. Now, we already saw the Rambam with regard to Bishul Akum. So first, let's look at the one he says about Pat Akum, then we'll review on Bishul Akum. So the next source you have the Rambam in his Hachot Macholot Asrot Perak Yudayin Halakhah Yud Gimel. This is regarding Pat Akum Yudayin Yud Gimel. Hidlik Akum et Hatanor ve'afa bo Yisrael. If a non-Jew lights the fire and a Jew bakes in it, O shehidlik Yisrael ve'afa Akum. Or the Jew lights the fire of the oven and a non-Jew bakes in it. Or a non-Jew lit the fire, a non-Jew baked in it, and a Jew came and, ignited the fire, blew the fire. Or he either raised the heat or lowered it. Since the Jew was involved in some way in baking this bread, the bread is now allowed. It is now kosher. Even if all the Jew did was throw a little stick into the oven, hitir kol hapat shabo. That allows all of the bread in this oven. She'ein hadavar ela liot heker. Shehapat shelahem asura. Because a Jew doesn't actually have to be involved in the baking of the bread. You just need a heker. You need a reminder. You need some sort of symbolic action just to remind you that, hey, they're not us. You can eat this bread, but you can't get too close to them. Because really, this bread is kosher. There's nothing wrong with this bread. So it's enough to have some sort of symbolic action. It could be just, adjusting the flame to remind you that off limits. There's a social distance that has to be attained. So when it comes to Pat Akum, all the Jew has to do is a symbolic act of involvement. What does the Rambam say with regard to Bishul Akum? And this we've already seen, but we'll look at it again. When it comes to Bishul Akum, the same parak, halakhah tet azayin, the Rambam requires a much more meaningful intervention on behalf of the Jew. Here he writes, we're not talking about bread. Dagim ketanim shmachan Israel. So you're talking about fish that a Jew salts, so that's okay because it's like cooking. Now just skip to the comma. So if a non-Jew goes and roasts the fish that the Jew already salted, that's fine. As long as the Jew cooked the food a little bit. Whether it's at the beginning, it's at the end, mutar. The food is allowed. It's a kosher. So if a non-Jew puts meat or a pot on the fire, and the Jew turns the meat over, and he stirs the pot, or the non-Jew put it on, or the Jew put it on, and the non-Jew finished it, it's allowed. So the Jew just has to do one act. However, what do we see? It needs to be an act which actually furthers the cooking. It's not enough to do a symbolic act as it is by Pat Akum. So we see that for the Rambam too, like the Ran, the laws of the Bishul Akum and Pat Akum are different. They have different laws. However, for the Rambam, it's Pat Akum which is more lenient. In this case, as long as a Jew does a symbolic act, it can be as little as throwing a little straw into the fire, that's adequate and makes the food kosher. By a Bishul Akum, on the other hand, the Jew must contribute to the cooking process. So for this reason, Pat akum and bishul akum are listed as two different isurim, prohibitions in the Mishnah. They're not the same. They have their own halakhot which apply to them. So now we are going to see a very major difference between pat akum and bishul akum is the fact that we don't actually hold of this, and we eat pat akum nowadays. And I mean, we're not always aware of this because of the very the Kashrut organizations, and that living in the U.S. at least, certainly Israel, but we don't have to read the labels to see what we can eat. Kashrut is such a large and powerful organization that we have the luxury of having hashgacha on foods and not having to worry about what's in this food or not. We're taken care of. However, a lot of breads which have a hashgacha are indeed pat akum. I don't know, but I assume Thomas's English muffins doesn't have a Jew turning on the oven. So why do we eat pat akum nowadays? And why is this a prohibition that really is not very relevant, other than, as we'll learn, Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, the days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur? So the seeds for this, of the leniencies of pat akum, are already found a little bit in the Babli. It's a machloket whether it is in the Babli, and very much so in the Yerushalmi. So we are now turning to section 3, which is, why do we eat pat akum? We just spent all this time, according to the Ran, it's very, very strict, and yet we eat pat akum nowadays. So we turn now to the sugya, also in Avodah Zarah, on this Mishnah, on the words of the Mishnah, Ve'ha'apat, Lamed Hey Amud Bet. And again, I've labeled it the Hebrew and Aramaic in accordance with the English translation, so you can follow along. Vehapat, and bread. So that was in our Mishnah. Remember, our Mishnah said Vehapat Vashem Shalom. Amar Rav Kana, Amar Rav Yochanan, said Rav Yochanan, the name of Rav Yochanan, Pat lo hutra be'abeitin. Bread was not made allowed by the court. The Beit Din never allowed a bread. Meaning, why would it say that? The Peshat is, because what did the Mishnah say? V'pat v'shemen shalahem, Rebbe u'Beit Dino hitiro hashemen. So Rebbe and his court allowed oil. They revoked the prohibition against having non-Jewish oil. So Rebbe Yochanan comes to say, but when it comes to a bread, Rebbe and his Beit Din never revoked the prohibition against bread. And you can just read it at that and nothing more. But the Babli, however, makes an inference. So line B, it says, Mechlal de'ika man deshare. That implies that there was someone who did permit bread. Meaning, from the fact that the Rabbi Yochanan points out that the Beit Din, that the court never allowed bread, meaning it was only that Beit Din who didn't permit bread. Implication is that there was another person who did allow a bread. Yeah, there was someone who did permit a bread. And now it brings two anecdotes, which it's hard to know if these support what was just said or coming to challenge it. So story number 1. D'chiata Rev Adimi Amar. When Rev Adimi came from the land of Israel to Babel, he said the following. Pamachat yatsa Rebbe l'sadeh. Rebbe, of course, talking about Rebbe Yehuda Hanasi, Rebbe Yehuda, the prince of the Mishnah, he once went to the field. Vehevi ovei kochavim lefana pat porani. And a non-Jew brought for him bread baked in this big oven. I brought you Rashi who explains what a purani is, hu tanur. It's an oven which is very big and its opening is to the side. Okay. Mafes made from flour. So, and Amar Rebbe said, wow, come on, Patzo, how nice is this bread? Like this artisan bread made by the non-Jew and whole foods is so nice. Mara'u chachamim le'osra. Why did the rabbis prohibit it? So that's what Rebbe said. Then says Rebbe. So then asked the Amara, Mara'u chachamim. What do you mean? Why the rabbis prohibit it? We know why. Mishum chatnu, because of intermarriage. So that can't be what Rebbe said. Rather, Ella, this is what Rebbe said. Mara'u chachamim le'osra basadeh. Why did the rabbis prohibit patakum in a field? Rashi says, why specifically a field? Rashi explains, because in the field, you're not having a nice sit-down meal. It's a ad hoc meal, so there's no concern that people will, grow too close to each other. So in the field, why would the rabbis prohibit pat akum? So that's what Rebbe said. Kisvura ma'am, that led people to think hitir Rebbe hapat, that Rebbe had allowed pat akum. It says Rebbe adimi lohi, but that's not the case. Rebbe lo hitir et hapat. Rebbe did not permit bread. So meaning, what Rev Adimi is saying is that there were people who mistakenly assumed that Rebbe had revoked the prohibition against pat akum. It says Rev Dimi, that never happened. Rebbe never allowed it. People only thought he had. Then Rev Yosef now says the same thing. Number 2, Rev Yosef be'itema Rev Shmuel bar Yehuda Amar. So either Rev Yosef or Rev Shmuel said, "Lo kachei ha'masa." No, that's not what happened. Ella, rather, this is what happened. Amru, this is the case that happened with Rebbe. One time Rebbe went to a place, and he saw that the students had no food. They had no food for them. Amar Rebbe, so Rebbe said, "Ein kan palter? Is there no baker here?" Kisvur ma'am lomar palter obey kochavim. Again, says Rebbe Yosef, the people mistakenly thought that Rebbe asked, "Is there any non-Jewish baker?" But again, v'hu lo amar ela palter Yisrael. But he was only asking, "Is there a Jewish baker?" So, to sum up, Rev Adimi says that people thought that Rebbe had permitted pat akum in the field, but they're wrong, says Rev Adimi. Rebbe never did, but people thought he did. Then Rev Yosef or Rev Shmuel says that people thought Rebbe had permitted pat akum made by a non-Jewish baker, but again, they were wrong. Rebbe never revoked pat akum in this way. So for both Rev Dimi and Rev Yosef, Rebbe never permitted pat akum. But the way you'd have to read the line B of this Get Amar is that people thought he had. Okay, but the Gemara does not end here. And now the Gemara seems to shift from Rev Dimi and Rev Yosef and go back to line B, which is Mechlal Dikaman de Shari, that implies that there were people who allowed it, and there were people who allowed it. So now go to line C. Amar Reb Chelbo. Reb Chelbo said, "Afilu leman damar pato beit kochavim." Even those who allowed non-Jewish bakers of bread, that only applies to where there's no Jewish baker. But if there is a Jewish baker, then no. Then that opinion would not allow you to buy the bread baked by a non-Jewish baker. That's Reb Chelbo. Reb Yochanan Amar, and now Reb Yochanan says in D, Afilu man zamar palto beit kochavim. Even those who say you can buy from a non-Jewish baker, Hane Mile, hey mem is Hane Mile, this only applies, these words are bisadeh, in the field. Abal be'ir, but in a city, no. In a city, you would not be allowed to buy non-kosher baked, non-Jewish baked bread, misham chatnut, because of intermarriage. Okay, so on the one hand, we just saw Rav Dimi and Rav Yosef say that people thought Rebbe allowed non-Jewish baked bread either in the field or if there's no Jewish baker, but they're wrong. Rebbe never allowed it. And now we have Rav Chabo and Rav Yochanan saying that pat akum is only prohibited according to Rav Chabo when there is a Jewish baker, but pat akum is permitted when there's no Jewish baker. And Rav Yochanan says that pat akum is only prohibited in the city, but it's permitted in the field. And by a field, we mean you're not having this nice sit-down meal. People just kind of snack in this ad hoc kind of manner and eat together and come and go, and it's nothing that would lead to a relationship. So they seem to say someone did allow pat akum, and yes, there may be limits on it's only in the field, only when there's no Jewish baker, but they seem to contradict what Rav Dimi and Rav Yosef said. And now let's just read the last line in this Gemara, where this now seems to go back to Rav Dimi and Rav Yosef. Ibo hava manchitz v'achil pat abe mitzri. So a man named Ibo was eating the bread of a non-Jew in the house of a Egyptian in the fields, Rashi explains. Amarlu Rava. So Rava said to them, Bitima Reb Nachman bar Yitzchak, and some say it was Reb Nachman bar Yitzchak who said, Lo tishtahu mine to Ibo. Don't talk to Ibo. Don't listen to him. Tika'achil lachma de'armai, because he eats the bread of a non-Jew. Stay away from this guy. He eats non-Jewish bread. So this seems to now hark to Rav Yosef and Rav Dimi, who say no one ever allowed pat akum, and now Rav is coming to say, so that guy who eats pat akum, stay away from him. He's not listening to what the halakhah is. So we see kind of two different voices in this Gemara. On one hand, Rav Dimi and Rav Yosef who say, yeah, there were some people who thought that Rebbe allowed pat akum, but that never happened. And then Rav Chabo, Rav Yochanan giving these mitigating factors to when pat akum would be allowed. Now, there's a really great run on the Dapei Harif. You know, if this was a Talmud, of course, I would go into it and how he shows the different ways to read this. So either you can say that Rav Chabo and Rav Yochanan are just explaining what these people who thought Rebbe permitted said, meaning these people who were wrong, when they were wrong and they thought Rebbe permitted pat akum, it was either only in the field or it was only when there's no non-Jewish baker. But meaning Rav Chabo and Rav Yochanan are not giving their actual opinions on the matter. They're just telling what these mistaken people thought. That's one way you could read it. Or another way to read it is that Rav Chabo and Rav Yochanan do disagree with Rav Dimi, that there is actually a fundamental dispute in this sugya. And the dispute is between basically lines B, which says that implies that there was a person who allowed it, and yes, there was. And so Rav Chabo and Rav Yochanan agree with the voice of B. And that's one view in this sugya. And the other view is Rav Dimi and Rav Yosef who say, no, this was never allowed. And B, you are wrong. Rebbe, pat lo hutzru beitin, and no one ever allowed it. And you can't make that in, for instance, that you make line of B. That's what Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Adini would say, whereas Rabbi Chabon and Rabbi Yochanan would say, no, yes, you can make that in, for instance. From the fact that the Beit Din didn't permit bread, that implies that there was one who did permit bread, and when they allowed a bread, either it's where there's no Jewish baker or in the field. Okay, so those are two different ways, and there are more, but at least two ways we can make sense of this sugya. Either everyone in the Bavli agrees that bread was never made allowed, and the only people who did think it was made allowed were people who were wrong, and it's those people who were wrong whom Reb Chabo and Rabbi Yochanan just explains. Or there's a fundamental dispute in this sugya between Reb Adimi and Reb Yosef, who say it was never made a kosher, versus Reb Chabo and Reb Yochanan and the anonymous voice of line B, who says no, there was a view which said pat akum was made permitted. So with this in mind, so we already see in the Bavli that there are these seeds for saying pat akum is permitted. So we're going to look at what Tosfos says about this. The medieval Rishonim, the medieval rabbis of Ashkenaz. And they say the following. So the next source you have, we're on page 3. Tosfos on our Gemara. Tosfos on the bet. On the line B, that implies that there is someone who allowed patakum. From the fact that Rabbi Yochanan said bread was not allowed in the court, that applies. That if the court wanted to, hava sharele, then they could have allowed patakum. If the court wanted to, meaning, so he's making Tosfos are making a different inference, not the inference of line of B, from the fact that the court didn't allow it. That implies that, okay, maybe they didn't, but other people did. No, says that Tosfos, from the fact that it says the court didn't allow it, that indicates that had the court wanted to, the court could have allowed pat akum. And how is that? How could a court have revoked a prohibition in the Mishnah? Says Tosfos, Alma, consequently, lo pashat isuro. It's because this original prohibition of pat akum never actually spread. It never took root all over. Umikan, and from here, samchu ata le'echol pat. We, us Jews living in medieval Ashkenaz, rely on this nowadays to eat pat hakum. Kevan shalo pashat isuro b'chol Yisrael. Since the prohibition never spread to all of the Jews. And we can also rely on another principle set forth by Rishon for they say, Ein gozrin gezerah al hatzibor, ela im kim rov hatzibor yecholim la'amod bo, which says that we don't make a decree against, on the Jewish people unless most of the people can abide it. And Tosfos seems to be prohibiting pat akum is not practical. It's not realistic to say Jews cannot eat the bread baked by a non-Jew. Now, this is because, one, as I mentioned, I think, bread was the staple of the human diet for a very long time. They didn't have, lasagna one night, chicken something the other night. People's main means of food was bread, and bread like foods. So if you make it hard to eat bread, people won't have anything to eat. Now, why was it so hard to eat bread if you prohibited pat akum? As I mentioned, I think last week and the week before, that in medieval Europe, especially in Germany, well, all over medieval Europe, people didn't necessarily own their own ovens. It was hot, it was dangerous, and often there was one oven for the whole city, the whole town, and it was generally could have been owned by the feudal lord or the nobleman, and the oven was therefore often not at the Jews' disposal. I know later on in more modern Europe, often people didn't have the means, even if people could own their own ovens, they didn't necessarily have the oven necessary to make bread. It would be made in the non-kosher bakery. But certainly in medieval Europe, there was often just one oven for everyone to use. And if you prohibited pat akum, there's a chance that Jews would not be able to have any kind of bread whatsoever. Because often they also, if it's not their oven, they also aren't in control of who bakes in the oven either. And also what we mentioned last time, that the prevalence of slaves doing domestic labor was also a very huge factor. And many of the halakhot related to a kashrut and making bread is no different as well. So says Tosfot, it's not realistic to prohibit pat akum, and it's not a prohibition that the people would be able to live with. They would go hungry. And what's the halachic justification for that? We see from this Gemara that this was a prohibition that from the fact that the Beit Din could have revoked it had they wanted to, proves that it never spread to all the Jewish people. So it was a weak prohibition to begin with. So there's a practical reality on the ground that the Balei HaTosfot deal with, that we don't control our ovens, and we won't have anything to eat if we don't allow pat akum. But there's also the halachic hanker, the halachic justification of being, it's not enough to just say, well, this is what people do, so we'll allow it. But we can also find an anchor for it in the Gemara itself. That we see that this was never a prohibition that spread to all the Jewish people, and that must be why, had the Beit Din wanted to, it could have revoked it. Now, while it's not clear from the Bible, we see there are two views whether pat akum ever was actually revoked or not. It's actually quite clear from the Yerushalmi that it was. And now we'll turn to the next text, the bottom of page 3. This is the parallel Yerushalmi sugya on our Mishnah. So it talks about piatan, which is pot, a pita, bread. That's where pot, that's bread, pat akum, like a pizza. So their bread. Rabbi Yaakov bar Acha b'shem Rabbi Yonatan. So Rabbi Acha bar Acha in the name of Rabbi Yonatan. Sorry, pat mehalachot shel imumhi. So the law allowing pat hakum is the translation here is an irregular measure, meaning it's not something which is normally done. Why? So I skipped a little bit. It's going to explain it. Makom she'ein pat Yisrael mitzuya. If you're in a place where there's no Jewish baked bread, ba'adinhu shetei pat nochrim asura. By law, pat akum should still be prohibited. But imu aleha v'hitiruha. But they acted irregularly and they allowed it. Why? Mipnei chaye nefesh. Because this is a matter of life. If there's no bread, then people won't be able to live. They'll go hungry. If there's no bread, you have to allow the bread. If that's the only bread available, allow pat akum. Rabbanan de Kesarim b'shem Rabbi Yaakov bar Acha. says the rabbis of Caesarea, which was a very big city during the Talmudic era. Just, come to Israel, see the archaeological site of Caesarea. So the rabbis there said in the name of Rabbi Yaakov Bar Acha, Kedivrei Mish hu matir. So even according with the position who allows eating pat akum, ubilvad min halpalter. It's only if the bread was baked by a baker. But they never allowed bread baked by just a regular, non-Jewish homeowner. Just a regular balabas, a balabait. But lo abdin kain. However, they don't actually practice the law like that. They have pat akum even of regular non-Jews and not just bakers. So we see that while the Bavli infers that there was a place which allowed pat akum, the Yerushalmi provides definitive testimony that that was indeed the case. Pat akum was allowed. Definitely in the cosmopolitan city of Caesarea. By the way, there weren't just Jews living there. It was a very big population of Samaritans, pagan Romans, very big Roman city with a large Jewish presence as well. So we see this is not just a theoretical inference that the Bavli makes, that Pat Akum actually was revoked in the land of Israel. And the Rush, the last of the Tosafis, brings this Yerushalmi as another proof, another justification for dispensing with the prohibition against Pat Akum. So he cites the Yerushalmi as well. First he says, and so first he cites the Yerushalmi, and then being a Tosafis, he also says the same thing that the Tosfot says. Mitik Amar Talmuda, from the fact that our Bavli says, Mechal de'ika man de our line of B, that implies that there was one who allowed Pat Akum. Mashma, that implies not what Tosfot says, that they could allow it if they wanted to, but mashma sheyadua hayalahem sheyesh mekomot shenhagim bo heter. By our Bavli in line B, in inferring that there were places which must have allowed Pat Akum, that wasn't just theoretical. It's because they knew there were places which allowed Pat Akum. What's the proof of that? The Yerushalmi. And now says the Rush, uvimekomot shenagu bo heter. And if you're in a place where a people are lenient and eat Pat Akum, what does that show? Lo pashat sham isuro. That must be a place where the prohibition never spread in the first place. Va'alzeh samchu hagedolim shalo asroto levenei medinatan shenahagu bo heter. And this is what the great rabbis rely on when they allow the people in the places where they live to eat Pat Akum. And they don't prevent them. They don't prohibit them from eating Pat Akum. This is why. Because we see that there were places which did allow Pat Akum. And if you're living in a place where people eat Pat Akum, that indicates that that was a place where the prohibition never spread in the first place. So, A, says the Rush, there are places where the prohibition never came to in the first place. But then he says more. Even if you live in a place where the prohibition spread, you even have room to be lenient. Okay, so he says, first we'll just finish up. If you live in a place where you're lenient, it's a place where the prohibition never spread. And it's proven, and it's also a proof later on that the prohibition never spreads all of Israel. But then he says, even if you live in a place where the prohibition does apply, makom shehetanabo shlosha yamim, if you're in a place where there's been no food for 3 days, Pat she'oved kochavim mutar mipnei chaye nefesh. She invokes again the Yiru Shalom. If you're in a place where there's been no food for 3 days, you can have hatakum to save your life. Uverov mikomot pezurenu ein paltar Yisrael matzoi. And in most of the places of our exile, most of the places where us Jews now live, there are no Jewish bakers. So even if you can get bread, maybe, but there's no Jewish baker, it's as if you haven't had food for 3 days, and you also can have pat akum. And we also saw in the Yerushalmi that they allowed pat akum mishum chay nefesh to, help preserve their life, because there was no Jewish bread available. So to review what we've done, we haven't seen everyone here, but at least we'll see. So why don't we keep pat akum? So far we've seen Tosfos, who said, my camera's in front of me, I think, since the prohibition didn't spread to every place, therefore a Beit Din could revoke it. And if you live in a place where people aren't following it, even if the Beit Din didn't actively revoke it, that must be one of those places where the prohibition never spread in the first place. The Rush gives 2 answers. I'll say number 2 first. I don't know why I did in this order, but it didn't even spread to all countries like France, Spain. So therefore, we don't have to observe it. And he also adds, well, there's no Jewish baker, and hence it's chaye nefesh. It's a matter of, he says life preservation now. Does he mean it's just that there's no, meaning I'm making my own bread, but there's no nice artisan bread coming from a bakery? I'm just making my own bread? Not clear. But if there's no Jewish baker, then that's another reason to eat pat akum, even if you live in a place where pat akum still applies. And, I have to note that the Rush, though he was a Tosafist, he moved from Ashkenaz to where we know Tosafist says people were not following pat akum, to Sepharad milieu, where we know the Rambam says pat akum does apply. We can be much more lenient with regard to pat akum than bishul akum, but unlike the Tosafists, Rambam does not say pat akum is inapplicable. It does apply. Jew can be involved in any minuscule sort of way, but we still have to be strict for it. Whereas the Russians comes to say, even if you're in this place where maybe we're following the Rambam, and a Jew should be involved, but if there's no Jewish baker, you can be lenient, have pat akum, if the Jew didn't throw the straw into the fire or adjust the heat, as it were. Okay, but next time we're going to continue with this, and we'll see how the Rambam dealt with this Amara between Reb Dimi and Reb Yosef and Reb Chabo, and what the law is halakhah. But it seems our time has come to an end, and I could go over, but I feel like maybe I shouldn't. So thank you all so much, and I look forward to learning with everyone again next week, and I will review, this sugya in order to then see what these other opinions, which we're going to look at the Ran and the Rambam as well. So everyone have a wonderful week, and thank you so much. Next week we'll continue pat akum.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Strauch, for a great class. I'm looking forward to continuing next week. And thank you to everyone who joined us today on Zoom, on Drisha Live, on Facebook. We are going to continue our fall programming tomorrow at 1 p.m. with the 4th part of a multi-part series by Dr. Hanan Gafni on the origins of academic Jewish studies. In addition to this class, we have many more classes happening right now. You can find out more information as well as the registration links on our website at drisha.org/classes or watch them live at drisha.org/live. Thank you again, Dr. Strauch, Schick, for this opportunity to learn with you. And for everyone who attended, we hope to see you soon at one of our upcoming classes at Drisha.